Hello, welcome to Stars, Cells, and God. I'm Jeff Zweerink. I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Fuz Rana. We're going to be talking about Neanderthal and human interbreeding and how anxiety plays out in your brain. Fuz, good to have you in the studio. I always enjoy our conversations.
Hey, Jeff.
I'm just going to throw the floor over to you.
Sure.
I find human Neanderthal interbreeding to be a fascinating topic as a non-biologist type person. So take it away.
Well, you know, when you drink the Neanderthal Kool-Aid, it's kind of hard to go back. So,
well, I have to say, this is one of the more troubling aspects as a Christian is if Neanderthals and humans interbred and not that they played around with each other and maybe even had viable offspring, that it became part of our gene line. That's one of those things I wrestle with. So I always appreciate the insight you bring.
Yeah. Well, and this discovery that I'm going to talk about will help to address, that concern to some degree. And this is based on work that was published by a European team of researchers in a journal called Science Advances. So this is actually available, at least when I read the article, as a preprint. But what they did in a nutshell was demonstrate that a particular gene that is found in both humans and Neanderthals called the PIZO1 gene, which codes for what's called an ion channel that's embedded in the cell membrane of red blood cells, actually can control oxygen binding to hemoglobin.
Okay.
And I'll explain how that works in a minute. But and the idea is that this gene is different in humans and Neanderthals, and they believe that difference actually creates a maternal fetal barrier or imbalance in oxygen delivery in human Neanderthal hybrids. And that actually not only would have meant that certain offspring of hybrids that would then breed with each other in second generations would not be able to live, but that it probably contributed in a significant way to the extinction of Neanderthals. So
it's got some pretty big implications.
Implications, but for our purposes, what it is highlighting is that humans and Neanderthals really were distinct species. Mm-hmm. And even though there was interbreeding that happened, there were genetic differences that essentially represent a species barrier, meaning that the two populations were unable to merge.
Okay.
Right, and that they really should be viewed as distinct populations. And that ultimately the hybrids were not healthy in a sense that they were not only viable but also had reproductive capabilities.
Okay.
So you mentioned before we kind of unpack the science, the idea that this whole idea of human Neanderthal interbreeding is troubling, right? And that really leads to the larger question of why I think this work is worth spending some time thinking about, is that ultimately this work has implications for the large question that every human being asks, which is, who are we? What is our place in the cosmos, right? Does my life have meaning and purpose and value, believe it or not? And there's really two fundamentally different answers, at least in the Western world. One is that humans have infinite worth and value because we're made in God's image, as the Bible teaches, and that idea of the image of God is really the foundation of the gospel, that we can enter into a relationship mediated by the person of Christ with the Godhead because we bear God's image. And the other model is, humans are just the product of an evolutionary history, and there really is no ultimate meaning or purpose to human existence. We're just glorified apes that, we're no more or less valuable than any other organism that has ever lived in Earth's history. There's nothing really special about us. Those are really the two extreme views that you see in play. And, this, project really does help to address that question, because one of the big concerns that people have, as you mentioned, is, if humans and Neanderthals interbred, then from an evolutionary perspective, that means, well, they must have started from a shared population at some point in the past. And as those two different evolutionary lineages diverged from that ancestral population, over time they became more and more distinct. But the fact that they could interbreed meant that they must still have some evolutionary connection to each other.
Right.
And therefore, that's why the interbreeding could take place. So many people see the interbreeding as really a death blow to this idea that humans uniquely bear God's image. Now, at Reasons to Believe, we take the view that Adam and Eve were real historical people that were created through God's direct intervention, made in his image, that every human being ultimately finds their ancestry in Adam and Eve. And that means, well, what do we then do with the hominins, creatures like Neanderthals? And our view is that, well, these were creatures that God made as well, that were intelligent, had emotional capacity, but they lacked the image of God. And therefore, we would expect there to be fundamental biological differences between humans and Neanderthals, and even behavioral differences that reflect the absence of the image of God in Neanderthals and the presence of the image of God in humans. So
if I get what you said there, that how you look at this from a worldview really impacts what your understanding of the process is. So it seems, I'm just going to take on as a given, whether, I realize that whether humans and Neanderthals interbred still has some complexity to it and debate of whether that's actually happened or not. But there does seem to be some DNA signature from Neanderthals in humanity, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so if you say there's interbreeding, from the perspective of the naturalist, this is evidence of common descent, that we were the same creatures and now we're just somehow a little bit genetically different, if you will.
Yep.
Whereas from a creation perspective, humans are designed, built by God, and it's almost like a perversion of the order, the interbreeding. So rather than it being fundamental and essential, it's a perversion of.
Yes, that's a great way to think about it. It represents a disorder or a perversion of the natural order of things, and that the capacity to interbreed, we would argue, it is due to common design.
Okay.
That there's shared design elements that humans and Neanderthals display that made that interbreeding possible. But we would also predict that the hybrids that resulted would have been just on the edge of being able to survive and reproduce.
Okay, I see where your comments are going. So if this is just common ancestor, you would expect the interbreeding to be pretty prolific, standard. I mean, at least relatively close to where the diversion.
And you might even argue that the two populations should have been able to merge with each other.
Okay, I gotcha. And so if you find that these the hybrid offspring are on the boundary of being able to survive, that would weigh in favor of a creation explanation as opposed to an evolutionary explanation.
Right.
Okay, I got the connection.
Yeah, and we do actually see genuine biological differences and behavioral differences between humans and Neanderthals. And I'm not going to rehearse that evidence. We've talked about it on past episodes of Star Cells and God. But we also are seeing evidence, too, that there appears to be species barriers between humans and Neanderthals. For example, there are what are called Neanderthal gene deserts in the human genome. These are regions in the human genome where there is no Neanderthal signature whatsoever.
Okay.
Now, even though you and I both have about 4% Neanderthal DNA in our genomes, the likelihood that those sequences are in the same location and are the same sequences is very low. And so
really? I always thought that was kind of the longer you were away from the interbreeding, it just kind of diluted.
Well,
so you're saying
it does.
And you and me, it would just be diluted differently.
Yes,
okay,
it would be diluted.
Okay.
And there were multiple, integration events or multiple interbreeding events. And so that means that this is a remarkable to me, a remarkable fact that you can reconstruct 40 to 60% of the Neanderthal genome just from the Neanderthal sequences in the human genome among the human population. That you can literally, and what that means is that we all have different sequences in different locations, but there are regions in everybody's genome that are where there's no Neanderthal signatures. These are called Neanderthal gene deserts, or introgression deserts is the technical term. And
can I ask a question about that before we get, this is a little bit of a diversion here. So, we're talking about Neanderthal deserts and what that means. Would we be able to reconstruct 40 to whatever percent of the Neanderthal genome if we didn't know Neanderthals existed? Is that something you can look at the human genome and say, oh, wait, there's something here, there must be another species, or we know Neanderthals and we can compare and say, oh, there's 40% and it lines up?
We would probably be able to do that because—
Be able to do which?
We would be able to reconstruct a genome for an unknown hominin.
Really? Okay.
Because people have looked at like Denisovan genomes, for example, Neanderthal genomes, and have said it looks like there may have been an interbreeding event with an unknown hominin. So there are, for genomes that we have, Neanderthals, Denisovan genomes, there does look like there was interbreeding between Neanderthals and Denisovans, but also with unknown hominins.
Okay, so that really, if I could, would it be correct to say then the distinctions between humans and Neanderthals are significant enough that we can look at a human genome and say that looks out of place?
Yes, yeah. There's like
so it is that distinct, and even apart from knowing that Neanderthals, Denisovans, or whatever existed, we would be able to look at the human genome and say it looks like there's something else going on here.
Yes.
That's remarkable. Okay, so now I'll come back to your point.
Yeah. But with regard to the introgression deserts or the gene deserts, because where those deserts occur are regions of the human genome that encode genes that are involved in cognitive development.
Okay.
And so what this seems to indicate is that that natural selection just simply would not allow Neanderthal contributions to the human genome in critical regions that likely are defining us as a species.
Interesting.
And so again, where we display the most significant differences in terms of cognition with Neanderthals appears to be an area that's protected in the genomes, where modern humans, even though they may have some Neanderthal contribution to other parts of their biology, when it comes to the cognitive development, neural development, there seems to be some kind of protective barrier there.
Interesting.
And so that seems to indicate that, that these Neanderthal human, interbreeding events were something that, from our model, are rightly understood as a disorder of what, God intended or what God had created. Right. And so this study is in line with that, showing that there's another piece of evidence that indicates a species barrier between humans and Neanderthals. And as I mentioned, this enzyme piezo-1, or this gene, is encoding what's called an ion channel. This is a protein that's embedded in the cell membrane of red blood cells, and it's a mechanical stimulated ion channel, meaning that when there's stress on the membrane, it causes the channel to open, and ions will flow into the red blood cell, and that changes the ionic strength of the cytoplasm, which then in turn impacts the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin. So it's an indirect effect, and it turns out that there is one amino acid difference between the piezo-1 channel in Neanderthals versus modern humans.
Okay.
And that difference, in the study, they did physiological experiments showing that difference is meaningful in that it leads to a more sensitive channel, which means a greater affinity of oxygen, or of oxygen by hemoglobin in Neanderthal red blood cells than in modern human red blood cells. Okay.
Okay. So you got in humans, we're going to have a particular piezo 1 ion channel. Neanderthals are going to have a piezo 1 ion channel. And when are the stresses caused by oxygen, or stresses cause something else in the cell, and that allows more oxygen?
Well, as red blood cells, for example, move through capillaries, it forces them to undergo deformation. Okay. And that creates mechanical stress on the cell membrane.
This now allows the membrane to absorb ions from the bloodstream?
Well, yeah. So ions are flowing through the channel.
Okay. All right.
That's changing the ionic strength of the cytoplasm, and that impacts oxygen binding to hemoglobin. So this is part of the mechanism by which the oxygen is going to be released in capillaries, diffusing into tissues that would need the oxygen.
Okay. So in the Neanderthals, the hemoglobin is going to more strongly bind to the oxygen, which means when they're stressed in there, it's not going to release it out into the other structures that are going to use the oxygen to power the cells.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Now, where this now has anything to do with hybrids is that when you have a human Neanderthal hybrid, that hybrid, the first generation hybrid, will have in its genome a Neanderthal copy of piezo 1 and a modern human copy.
Okay.
Right? And the Neanderthal version is dominant, which means if the two versions are present, the Neanderthal version is the one that's going to be expressed.
How do they know that? Is that what these studies are showing that's what? Okay.
Yeah. So it's dominant. So it's going to be the one that's going to be expressed. So what that then means is that in second generation hybrids, you're going to have some of the hybrids, the fetuses, actually having both copies of piezo 1 from the human source,
right? Which
means that the mother is going to more tightly retain oxygen than such that the fetus is going to be oxygen depleted or oxygen deprived.
Oh, interesting.
And likely will die.
Okay.
So the pregnancy will result in a miscarriage.
All right.
If you have a human Neanderthal hybrid that interbreeds with a modern human father, you're going to have the same situation.
Okay.
Right. So what that means is that some of the second generation offspring of the hybrids, whether they're interbreeding with a modern human father or two hybrids interbreeding, some of the offspring are not going to be able to survive. Yeah, they're not going to be carried to full term. Right. Now, and what they did is then did some modeling showing that, look, Neanderthal populations are small, they were insular, all right, they were already fragile. This type of loss of infants actually could drive the population to extinction very quickly as you start introducing the human version of this gene in the Neanderthal population through this interbreeding. And so they believe that this could have very well contributed to Neanderthal extinctions, but for our purposes.
So in your evolutionary model, as humans expand around the globe, they're going to interbreed with Neanderthals, and this will drive the Neanderthals to extinction. That's just a par for the course that humans are going to assume Neanderthals are human, they're not, and that's going to drive Neanderthals extinct. Basic idea there?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So, what this is showing is, again, that this is another piece of evidence that there was a species barrier between humans and Neanderthals. And yes, there was interbreeding, and yes, there were viable offspring that could interbreed themselves, but that they were really healthy and that there were protective mechanisms in place to keep humans and Neanderthals distinct from each other, even though that interbreeding happened. So again, this is something that's consistent with what we would expect, with regard to our model. I mean, to be clear, we would not want to see interbreeding happen. It would be cleaner for our model if there wasn't, but the evidence is there that there was interbreeding.
And there's a part of that if you, I've noticed that if you just read Scripture and say, what do you expect to find when you read what Scripture talks about, it's not surprising that interbreeding type stuff happens. I mean, those are the admonitions, don't do these sorts of things, the depravity of, what goes on in the time leading up to the flood. It's like that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Humans have that proclivity to them.
Right. Yeah. When, in Genesis 6, when it says the only thought in every person was evil all the time, I mean, is it really that surprising that interbreeding happened? And in Genesis 6, there's, with the description of the Nephilim, there's clearly some interbreeding that happened that God was displeased with. I don't know what's going on in that passage of Scripture,
right?
But it's very clear that this is something that involves interbreeding that God wasn't pleased with. Or, in Genesis 2, Adam is naming the animals and realizes none are suitable for them. Right. And then in the Levitical law, there's prohibitions against bestiality.
Yeah.
Right. So, there is that depravity, that disorder, and really, go ahead.
Well, and what strikes me as interesting, and I'm curious if this is part of the point you're making, is that it's almost like God has set things up knowing what humanity is going to do, but also ensured that in the midst, there's a limit to how what humanity can do to mess up God's plan. Because if you mess up the image of God in humanity, that's a problem, and God has set it's almost like he's put structures in place. It's like, okay, I realize some of this is going to happen, but it's not going to destroy my plan here.
Yes. Yeah. That's how I would see it.
Okay.
And there were some benefits for interbreeding where there are certain genes that humans picked up through interbreeding, particularly with regard to the immune system, that helped them to actually handle parasites as they were moving into new environments. And so, there's also places where there were positive contributions as a result of that interbreeding. And again, there's a biblical principle there that you intended it for evil, but God could use it for good. And so, even though this wasn't what God, had ordained, that this represents a disorder, that God still was able to work with that and bring about good, or bring about something that contributed to humanity's ability to fill the earth, to multiply and fill the earth.
That does have a flavor, though, because if I remember correctly, our rough timeline is, humanity originates 130,000 years ago, something like that. Flood happens something on the order of 60,000 years. The key point of that is that humans being introduced to Neanderthals is going to be after the flood primarily, correct? Yeah. Or where we're going to have the signature of that. So is this the sort of thing that is just frequently happening as humans migrate around? It seems like there's a more common, not like a few one-off type things.
Yeah, it looks like there were multiple instances where that interbreeding took place. I think at one point there was a debate as to how frequently was interbreeding happening. I think more and more anthropologists think that it was probably quite frequent.
Okay.
Right. And so, what does that mean exactly? I'm not sure, but it is an active area of debate.
Sorry, just another theological or biblical question I have is, would this interbreeding have happened before the flood or after? Would it have been passed down through Noah and his descendants? That's my question.
Yeah, well, it must have been.
Must have been, okay.
Yeah, because if the interbreeding happened before the flood, Noah and his family could very well have been impacted by that.
Okay. So there's nothing that says scripturally in the flood that somehow this was purified out or anything. Yeah. And my recollection was, even the further back you get, the more the stronger the Neanderthal DNA signature is. So it wouldn't kind of has a sense of it's been going on since the dawn of humanity almost.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And one final point to bring up here is that a lot of times people have questions like, would these hybrids have a soul? Mm-hmm. Would they bear the image of God? And, we've dealt with that issue multiple times, but there's two models for ensoulment. Traducianism, which is that our soul is inherited through a type of spiritual inheritance from our mother and father, just like our genetics comes from our mother and father with regard to our physical inheritance. And the other view is creationism, where God steps in and creates a soul in each individual, embryo or fetus at some point during the course of development. And you could argue that that the image of God isn't divisible, you can't cut it in half.
Right.
So if one of the parents had the image of God, you would expect the child to have the image of God. Or you could argue that if one of the parents was a human, that God would have respected the fact that there was a human father and would have created, or a mother, and would have created a child with the image of God, through a divine act. So in other words, this interbreeding is not comfortable for us, but there's nothing biblically that rules it out, and there's nothing theologically that creates real problems with this interbreeding happening. There's ways to handle it. And again, the bottom line is, the more that we're understanding the consequence of that interbreeding for the hybrids, the more that we're realizing that they were not these robust, healthy individuals necessarily.
No, I appreciate the discussion. It's interesting to see that where initially I would say, human Neanderthal interbreeding was a pretty serious blow for a creationist or a biblical model, that, again, when I look at Scripture, it doesn't surprise. There's parts of it that surprise me, and parts of it is like, oh yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. But even beyond that, it seems like there's, what you're bringing into this discussion is, there are ways to evaluate, does this really help the naturalist scenario, or does this make more sense in a design scenario? And it seems like this evidence weighs in the design scenario, that it's the fact that we're designed closely enough. There are some biological compatibilities, but it's on the boundary of doing it rather than it being at the center of it, which is what a naturalist scenario. Fascinating discussion. I appreciate that. So. So I thought as you're describing this, your comment about the distinction between the worldview you take is really interesting, because that's kind of at the heart of what I wanted to talk about. Is I think our worldview makes a huge difference in how our science progresses. This is kind of a little bit of an odd discovery for me, because my original interest in doing this was I was reading through Science Daily is one of the places where I go and just look at what new is coming out. And the one that struck my attention was an article titled, "Your Anxiety May Be Controlled by Hidden Immune Cells in the Brain." Oh, well, that's interesting, because, it's like I know how I struggle with anxiety. I see it in my family. And so I'm like, okay, what's going on in there? And so I go and I'm reading this article. And what they're arguing for is that there seems to be two types of cells in the brain that they're called microglia. It was a particular class, or the particular types of cells. But there's these two classes of microglia, that one seems to be an accelerator for anxious behavior, and the other seems to be a brake on anxious behavior. And not that I'm going to go into here's how the biochemistry of all that works, but just from a systems perspective, that you have this control mechanism in your brain that is multiple parts moving together, as opposed to a single thing that controls it. And, I love their analysis, or their analogy of a accelerator and a brake, because you think about how you're driving a car. If you have one or the other, and so, you just have an accelerator and then you have to navigate around, you have to rely on natural mechanisms to brake you. You can go, but you have to be very careful how you do things. And if you just have a brake, things can make you go. And then you say, all right, now I can keep my motion going and slow down periodically. But if you have both a brake and an accelerator, it's a whole lot more robust system in terms of what can be accomplished. And that's what I found fascinating about this particular article, is that it's arguing that what influences the level of anxiety is not a single, okay, as this thing goes up, anxiety goes up, as this thing goes down. It's actually, there's this dual control to it. And the interesting thing they found is that it's not just simply It's that they both work in concert. And so there's this very dynamic nature to it. And that's what I found interesting, is that it seems like it's this it's a far more complex system than what we thought. And that complexity gives, just like having a brake and an accelerator allows a car to do much more, having this more complex system allows the brain, and I would argue actually the mind, to do a lot more. But even beyond that, the fact that the anxiety is actually mediated or controlled by what are immune cells in the brain rather than the neurons in the brain. Because you think, okay, anxiety is a conscious thought. It's a thought process, if you will. And it turns out that the things that are controlling this are actually the cells in the brain that are responsible for repairing damage and stuff. It's not the conscious, or it's not the thought process, if you will. I found that really kind of remarkable, because in my little bit of study, what I found, or the thing I'm going to argue or wanting to argue here, is that when we looked at the brain, if we look at it as it's just good enough, it just gets by, it doesn't seem to match what we find. Is that as we're looking, it seems this highly designed system that is got a purpose and function behind it, that if we come into it with a kind of, well, how can we explain what's there? It's an evolutionary kludge job. It's just good enough. We almost miss the level of design that is there. Mm-hmm. Because, just in terms of looking at the cells in the brain, as I understand it, you've got the neurons, which are electrical conductors and transmit the signals and the information, if you will. And then you've got these glia, which are all the other kinds of cells. They're the ones that build the myelin around the neurons so that it propagates properly. There are other ones. And then you have these what are called microglia, which, among other things that they do, are kind of the immune system of the nervous system, or the immune response of the nervous system, which I found very interesting, because for your immune system I'll make two comments about that. One is that these microglia are actually in their normal state, or in their resting state, or in their, I would say, monitoring state. They basically relatively small with these large tentacles that go out and reach, and they're very sensitive to changes in chemistry and systems there. But when they detect a problem, they basically retract, they grow, they engulf toxins, they engulf plaque, they engulf the stuff, even neurons and synapses that are not supposed to be there, are either redundant or extraneous or damaged. They're the repair system in there. And so it's that struck me as odd, but then, as I began reading in there, it's a very sensitive system, so that when problems arise, it detects it very quickly. But also it's a system that needs to be there because there's a blood-brain barrier, which keeps the antigen, the stuff that would normally clean up the immune system for the body, it actually keeps all that out. And so it just seems like there's this very robust design to it. It's like, okay, the immune system, the nervous system has to work incredibly well. It determines how the brain works, which is this incredibly complex organism. And what I found, or not organism, it's an incredibly complex structure, if you will, that where we build computers, you build the sensitive components and then you build protections around them so that they work, because when they work well, they're incredibly proficient, and they're also highly susceptible to being damaged. I think about humanity, or humans, we live, if we have a temperature that our brains work in a 2 to 3 degrees Celsius range. You get much above 104 Fahrenheit, which is about 2 to 3 Celsius above our normal state, and you start killing cells off really rapidly. I don't know how cold you can go, but I know it's not much colder than that as well. So there's this very narrow range, yet we operate in the Antarctic, which temperatures are sub-zero, to deserts, which are 130 degrees, and our bodies operate in that. And so I see, as I was studying this, what I found was that not only is the immune system within the brain or in the nervous system very good, it's a secondary system that has to be there because the immune system of the body can't be what does that because it's just this really well-designed system, I guess. That's what I was kind of coming out with.
Do the researchers understand how the different glial cells mediate anxiety?
Yeah, so what they found, or what they did, and this is the experiment that I found interesting, so kind of getting off of the big design to some of the details of it, is they were looking at mice, and I know Hughes talked about this, I think you would agree with this statement, is that the fact that as humans we can study mice and get insight into humans, it's almost like God has put various creatures around that you can't do these experiments on humans, but you can get insight by doing the experiments over here. So what they did was had a particular class of mice, and there's far more detail to this than I'm going to go into, but that is fascinating. But they basically took mice where there's one kind of this microglia, which are called, I wrote it down, it's HOXB8 microglia, and then there are non-HOXB8 microglia. And what they found is that the HOXB8 glia, the conclusions they drew, that the HOXB8 tends to temper anxiety, and the non-HOXB8 actually drives anxiety. So when you have an increase of the non-HOXB8 microglia, the mice exhibited excessive grooming and, like they would avoid open spaces, just anxious behavior. And interestingly, when they had mutant HOXB8 microglia, they also had that. So, but if you had a balance between the non-HOXB8 and the HOXB8, there was no anxious behavior exhibited. So you could have none of either, and you would get no anxious behavior. You could have high levels of both, and you would get no anxious behavior. So as they're working in concert with one another, again, it gives you a very high dynamic range of what environments you can respond to.
Is there an understanding at this point of how these different glial cells are interacting with the neurons to contribute to the anxiety, or is that still an open question?
This, to the extent I could understand the study, that was not what they were looking at here. What they were specifically looking at is actually identifying whether this accelerator brake model of looking at things was correct. And so they took various mice where they had, another interesting thing about the microglia is that basically the cells that are, or where they're generated is fairly early in either gestation or just after birth.
And are those populations stable over time, or do they actually fluctuate?
They're stable in that there's nothing that's reproducing them.
Right.
But they're dynamic in that they have a cycle of regeneration is not the right word they use, but the proliferation and apoptosis.
Okay.
So they do have a lifetime in which they'll live, but they also generate. So there's a dynamic nature to them within the central nervous system, but they're not being steadily supplied from outside the central nervous system.
Okay.
And so what they were able to do is develop mice that had various mixtures, various combinations of the HOXB8 that are functioning the way they're supposed to, mutant ones where they had non-HOXB8, various, and they were able to just grow mice, and they're actually doing intra-brain transplants of them. So they say, okay, this one has none of this, and so they could implant the various kinds and see what would happen. So they could get a wide variety of what's going on. And interestingly, they were actually able to develop mice that could actually breed instead of having a mix of so that only 1/4 of the 4 options would be that all 4 options. So it was a way of, there was even a humaneness about how they were generating the mice so that there weren't as many mice that were being sacrificed. But what the big thing they found, or what they were able to, the data they were able to generate showed is that where the mice had good HOXB8 microglia, they didn't show the anxiety. Where they had an excess of non-HOXB8 microglia, there was lots of anxiety. But interestingly, even in the mutant HOXB8, which is supposed to control anxiety, it seemed to actually, having that actually exacerbated the anxiety. And so they're arguing that there's even this gain of function that these mutant HOXB8 microglia were able to have there. And the study, just that they could do the study was fascinating. Yeah. But what struck me about this is that, and I'm going to make a semi-speculative theological connection, is that the anxiety isn't a function of how you're thinking. It's you've got this immune response that's going on, that the immune response is responding to something that's wrong, and how the immune response is what's driving the anxiety. And I couldn't help but draw this connection to Philippians 4, 6, and 7. It says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, shall guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. That it's like anxiety is it's a disordering of our mind, not the natural state. You're going to be anxious or not. It's your mind is supposed to work, and where there's peace, there's not going to be anxiety. And so by no means am I making an argument, well, just go out and pray and you're going to solve everything. I think there are genuine chemical imbalances. I think there can be great advances in developing chemical or drug and dietary and physiological treatments for people who just can't regulate. Their bodies aren't regulating this well to help them get to be able to have the so I think there's some great medical advances there. But it does seem like if Christianity is correct, there's this, we are not just bodies, we're not just souls, we're a union of body and soul. And so what we do in our spiritual life impacts our body, and what we do in our body impacts our spiritual life as well. And so this connection between don't be anxious, instead pray and recognize that God's in control. The peace that he has is what will resolve that anxiety there.
It's as you're talking about, your thoughts there, am drawn to this model that Matthew Stanford, sorry.
It's like he's a quarterback.
Yeah. I always do that. Matthew Stanford, who is a neurologist or neuroscientist who's a Christian, wrote a book a number of years ago called The Biology of Sin. A very provocative title, but his whole point is that, if you think about kind of a tripartite model for the human being, where there is the brain, the mind, and the spirit, that there's a recognition that those are in a dynamic interplay. That when as a Christian, when you're born again, your spirit is renewed, and your spirit can influence your mind, and your mind can influence the brain, and it goes the other direction as well. And so it seems to me like that what you're describing here would be explicable with that particular model, that we're not just simply a ghost in the machine where our spiritual makeup is bouncing around in us, right? And that's really who we truly are, but that there is an integration of the immaterial and material aspects. I think a theologian named John Cooper presented this idea called mutualistic dualism, where we are immaterial and material self, but that there's an interplay between the two, and that our true humanness is when both are present and both are integrated. And so that allows us to have a model from a Christian perspective for the human being that recognizes, there really very well could be a cellular imbalance that contributes to anxiety, and that through, as you said, through diet, through medication, you might be able to mitigate that anxiety, that it truly is a physiological, organic effect. Or there could be elements where maybe through how we think, right? As Paul said, no longer be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? And so it tells us that by renewing our mind, by focusing on the things that are good and true and righteous, that it can impact us, maybe even our brain physiology. And of course, through the power of the Holy Spirit, we're controlled at a spiritual level.
Right.
Right. And that can influence how we think, which maybe in turn can influence our brain biology. So it seems like as a Christian, not only do we have access to, the medical treatments that maybe helps to deal with these imbalances, but that through prayer, that in supplication, that we can reduce that anxiety.
Right. No, that's a great point. And it seems to me, or I'll kind of tie back to my initial point, that the worldview you adopt influences the direction your science takes, is that if naturalism is correct, and I'm not talking about saying, okay, for scientific purposes, we're going to restrict ourselves to natural explanations here, because those are the things that you can really quantify and measure in the lab, and that's what allows science, or I would argue, allows science to progress, that kind of methodological naturalism, if you will. But there are, and I think it has the success that it's had in physics and chemistry, and it's borne out. What I think really doesn't impact how galaxies behave. It's not the right connection to make. But if, now we're starting to talk about how do humans interact. I mean, let's just ignore, or, set aside the rest of the animal world. But if we are body, soul, and spirit, or body and spirit, whatever is the correct way to look at that, if there's something more than just the physical, then how we approach that with our worldview is going to have a dramatic difference on the questions we ask and what we do. Because, if now this may be a little bit of a perversion, but I think there are Christians who have taken, well, God's in control of everything, so therefore let's just not even worry about understanding. I think that's a little bit of mischaracterization of how Christianity's thought about things. But there can be, well, God did it, therefore I don't need to answer it.
Right.
On the flip side, if you say, well, there's no God, you're going to, if we are genuinely have this non-physical component, you're just going to completely miss what are key interactions here. And, you're talking about anxiety in the cells. I don't see how you have a solution outside. The only solution seems to be, well, how can we mediate the physiology? How can we change the amount of whatever, the microglial cells in there? Which that is something, I mean, it's at least part of what's going on. It's just not all of what's going on. And so, and I would argue, particularly when it comes to humanity, the physical and non-physical components are both important interactions. So if you're omitting that, you're missing a big part of the picture. And, you're driving around with just an accelerator or just a brake. But if you put both of them together, I think you got a great tool to understand things a lot better.
Yeah, neat stuff.
I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today, and I want to encourage you to join in the comments below. Let us know what you think and interact down there. Remember to like and subscribe this video. Remember, we have new podcasts that drop each week here on Wednesday, right here on YouTube and in your favorite podcast app. Take this video, share it with somebody else, and have a great conversation with them as well. And remember, the more we learn about science, the more reasons we have to believe in the God of the Bible.